I don't want you to put stuff in your box. I want you to crawl out of the box and live in the world that actually exists.
Yes.
Because there's an entire huge world, and I'm guilty of it as well. And being autistic, I like I'm kind of like my puppy. It's so strange to me. He has this little travel kennel, and that's his little safe space. And so half the time I'll think that he's getting in trouble or doing something that he shouldn't be doing. And I'll go find him, and he's just in his little travel kennel, just happy as can be. And I'm like, dude, like, you're free right now. You could go do whatever you want. And he goes back to the little travel kennel. And I don't want to just live in my little travel kennel, even though it's really safe and comfortable there. I want to get outside of that. I want to get outside of the box completely, and people talk about, thinking outside of the box. And I think there's a chapter in Hustle where I talked about, acting and executing outside of the box, but really it's living outside of the box. It's living outside of living in this space and this mindset of who says.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because
you see so many people though that are doing that, right?
Yes.
Like that are living in tiny houses, or that are living in an RV, or that they're, they pack up their family and they travel the world, and all this other stuff of like, it's what I realized with when people said that I was crazy when I skipped scholarships to law school and didn't write my master's thesis. And then when Pepperdine came knocking and said you could teach sports psychology, but you need a master's, you have a master's, right? In anything. And I was like, no. And then people once again were like, see, you messed up your life. You could have. And it's like, well, no, there's always a back door. There's always different ways. And like, it's never been easier to create whatever type of life that you want. Maybe not what you want, but like, there's so many different ways of doing life that we don't just have to live in this box model, this box house model. Like there's, people get mad at me because I live in an apartment and I live in a high rise downtown, and they're like, well, why aren't you buying a house? You need to buy a house. And I'm like, listen, maybe one day I'll buy a house. Maybe I won't. But just because that's what everybody else used to do doesn't mean that that's what I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, well, this is the way that you, and I'm like, well, I've already done what you're saying I've already done. I just did it in a different way. You're trying to get me to be able to have enough money saved up to where then it's going to spit me off enough money to be able to live for the rest of my life. And I'm like, I already did that. I just did it with intellectual property. But they're coming at me with this old school mindset that that's all they know. So it seems crazy to them that somebody's doing something that doesn't fit in that box.
I love it. Jenny says, it's what you say is we don't know our fullest potential. And yeah, that is true. That is absolutely true. And like you said, this podcast, a lot of what I'm doing, it's like, a lot of people are like, well, why are you doing that? Like, I would be paralyzed with fear to do that. I would I lived 35 years in Wisconsin, and I moved my family to Virginia just because we needed a change in culture. And like, I put my career on hold and stayed at home with my kids while my wife pursued her career out here, because she did that for me at the start. I mean, we started businesses, she started businesses, and I helped her, but like, it's my turn to do that, and it's going to be okay. And like, it's helped me discover my passion for this.
Yeah.
And, to break it down in very simple terms, like I grew up with boiled vegetables. I grew up with no salt and pepper in food. Like, I was very cookie cutter and vanilla with what I liked. And then I started watching the Food Network, and I'm like, why don't I try this? Who knows if I even know what my favorite food is? I probably haven't tasted it yet. And I still may not have. But it's time for me to get out there and try it. And that's exactly what you're saying. And it's just, I know we're running a little bit long. Do you have a few more minutes, or should we start wrapping it up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
The way that you write in the way that I've heard your speeches and I've heard you on a few other podcasts. You tell a lot of, and you've done it on this one as well. And I love it because I also do it. We teach through stories and the power that comes with that. Where did you get your inspiration to really use that as the vehicle to get your message through? Because it's powerful, and you can do it in a way that kind of turns people off, and you can do it in a way that really inspires, and it's inclusive. And that's the way that you do it. I think.
I don't know exactly. I know John Gordon played a pretty big role in it from a pure book standpoint. But I think even before that, I didn't know how to do it necessarily in terms of writing fables before John. John was the one that really pushed. Chop Wood, Carry Water wasn't Chop Wood, Carry Water. Chop Wood, Carry Water was Start Here, Mental Training Finally Made Simple. IMG Academy had asked me to head up mental conditioning and leadership six and a half years ago. And I knew that no go-to book in sports psychology had been written. I knew that the reason why they were pursuing me as hard as they were is because I was kind of that guy. And so why not try and write it? So it was Start Here, Mental Training Finally Made Simple. And there was just a 45-page section of that book that was a little small fable called Chop Wood, Carry Water. John Gordon read it and read the draft, and he said, get rid of the rest of this stuff, expand this, make this is the book. I fought him for a couple of weeks, and then I finally relented and did it. But I think that what I had already been doing is, there's a Bible verse that says they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Your story is so powerful. That's why it's so powerful when we sit down and we break bread with people and we hear their story. I realized that my story was powerful. I actually do remember one specific point very early on. I was the director of mental training for Oregon women's golf, and the head coach, who I loved dearly, Rhea Scott, I did a presentation, and I always felt like I had to lean really heavy on the science because of not having a sports psychology degree. Mm-hmm. And I did this 2.5 hour presentation, and afterwards, and Rhea's just like the sweetest human. And she came up to me and she was like, Joshua, that was amazing. And I was kind of used to getting that response. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of trying to break down, like, I was like, okay, I was like, thank you so much. I was like, but what is it? Like, what was it that was amazing to you? And she was like, your stories. It's just your stories. And that was kind of a really pivotal point for me, that it's going to be the stories. And then when you look at like little kids, like your kids never ask you to tell them a statistic. They ask you to tell them stories. Mm-hmm. We are story-driven people. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves. We tell other people stories about ourselves. Sometimes those stories aren't even really attached to reality. They're more like what you were talking about with perception and reality. And I think what that quote is getting at is that our reality is 90% perception, and it's just what we perceive. It's our perception is our reality, in the same way of whatever story we've been telling ourselves, that becomes our reality. And so stories are how we make sense of the world. Stories are how we make sense of our life. And that, if you look at kids, that's how they learn. And if you look at media, if you look at movies, if you look at what we're attached to, it's why I'm struggling so much. This last year has been so hard for me with books, because every single book I pick up, I can't get through it. There's the story isn't there. There's no captivating stories that are pulling me in. And so, yeah, it just makes sense that storytelling is the way that you can really get through to people. And simultaneously, I always felt like that I can tell you about a tool. I can tell you about a mental training thing. I can tell you about the science, but really what you're going to remember is the story. And especially if it's a yada story from my experience of what I've done. You know, when I talk to kids that, you know, I'm not teaching you sports psychology. I'm sharing how I went from the last pick on the team at Duke to being the ACC Player of the Week, the Duke Student Athlete of the Week, and finishing second in points to the best player in the country. I'm sharing a story how I never scored a goal with my head in my entire life until I started using visualization. And then all of a sudden I scored a goal that was worthy of being on SportsCenter top 10 against a top 25 opponent. And then the next week I scored another one, and it was 2 weeks after applying visualization. Like, that is the type of stuff that people go, oh, it's what sells on infomercials, testimonials. They overcame them by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. You can argue with facts. It's really hard to argue with somebody's story. Some people will. Like, if I tell you my story, it's a lot harder to be like, that didn't happen. That's not true. But if I tell you a fact or a stat, it's easier to argue with that. Yeah. But stories just connect with us on such a deep level that creates real change and inspiration.
And, you know, like, I mean, the emotional level that you can get stories down to that make you put yourself in those shoes. Like, I'm just remembering all of these stories that I've learned from, that I have no experience in, but when you hear that story that touches you at that emotional level, and you feel yourself there, you know, it's probably the most powerful way to learn that we have. And somebody that you talk about in Pound the Stone, Hustle, and I've heard you bring him up on podcast as well as your pastor. Is it Judah Smith?
Yeah.
How much influence has he had on the way that you tell stories?
Oh, Judah is the best storyteller in the world. It's not even close. Bert Kreischer is probably second. But yeah, there's the difference between people like Bert Kreischer and Kevin Hart and Judah is that Judah will tell a story. I was at a dinner with Judah in early December, and he stands up and he shares a story for like 20 minutes. And afterwards, I went up to him and I was like, did you like prepare that? Were you like really like, and he was like, no, I'm just like, it's insane because these other guys, like, they go to comedy clubs and they build sets. Mm-hmm. They practice and they practice and they practice what works. They practice the timing. They practice everything. Now, Judah's been speaking since he was 12, 13 years old, maybe even younger. And it's something I try and be very clear about to people because I know that I have a skill set and a gift. I know that I'm anointed, especially when I get on stage. But again, my mom had me in preaching competitions when I was 6 years old. I think I won my first preaching competition at 7 years old. So there's a long track record of work and skill that's been put into that craft. But yeah, like I watched Judah get up and tell this story, and I was blown away. And yeah, there's just nobody that's even close. And so what I did with Judah is, the first time I heard Judah speak, I was blown away. And then he started coming to Los Angeles to speak. And in the beginning, it was twice on Wednesdays, and I would stay for both talks and I would take notes in both. And then at one point he was speaking 3 times on a Wednesday, and I would stay at all 3 and take notes at every single one. And there's nobody, I would say, besides my mom, when I was younger, who's had more of an influence on my life than Judah. And especially from a storytelling perspective, I've studied him more than I've studied anybody else.
That's incredible. I've heard you, as I said at the beginning of the show, like, passion is infectious, and the energy, and like the way that you talk about him makes me honestly want to go to church and hear him preach. Because
you don't have to go to church, you just go online.
You go online and look it up, YouTube. I mean, that's a good point. Yeah. I haven't been to church in 18, 20 years. But
the thing that I tell people to start with him is there's this thing called the Jesus's Music project on you may be able to find it on YouTube as well, but it's definitely on iTunes. And there's about 6 different tracks in there that there's music behind it, and he storytells in it. And the most beautiful thing about the way that he teaches is so many people that are in religious Christian settings are more doing what I do, and they're trying to teach self-help, and they're trying to teach morality or a right way to live, or principles or something like that. Judas shares stories, and he teaches nothing but Jesus, and pure unadulterated Jesus. And that's the thing that is most attractive. Like, people flock to Jesus. That's what is so sad about what's going on right now, especially in the Western world, is that people are running away from Christianity because people that are claiming to follow Jesus have made it more about rules and more about don't do this and tribal warfare than they have about actually following Jesus and loving people. And so it's always funny when I would speak in public schools, I'd always inevitably have 1 or 2 people come up to me and be like, I just don't know how you do it. Like, how do you, like, I know that I can hear the Bible verses and what you're saying. I can hear like where this is coming from. Like, how can you just not get it? And I'm like, listen, we live in America. People don't need to hear about Jesus. People need to experience his love. People need to experience Jesus. When you experience Jesus, you don't ever want to leave that. That space is different. Religion equals do. Jesus equals done. A lot of people are getting that twisted and mixed up and thinking that it's religion and it's do. And Jesus already did it. So it's accepting his radical, reckless love and grace that we can't even comprehend. So my job isn't to share Jesus with people. And I'm very frank about this. I'm like, if I want somebody to hear about Jesus, I'm going to point them to Judah. There's nobody better that's going to share that than Judah. My job is to love people. And I'm going to mess that up a lot, but my job is not to go out and try and convince somebody or share something with somebody. That, in my opinion, is just not my job. My job is to live and love them in such a way that they want to ask what's different about you. And if they can't ask what's different about you, and believe me, there's a lot of people that can't. I'm really good at this. I'm really aware of it. I'm really good at articulating things in these types of settings. Living is really hard. And if I'm not living in such a way that somebody asks what's different, then it's probably best if I just shut my mouth, because it's only going to make things worse. So until somebody wants to ask me, hey, I don't understand. Like when somebody says, it doesn't make sense to me how your value can come from who you are and not from what you do. And I'm like, yeah, I get that. The only way that's true is if somebody was willing to give their life for you, that you're worth that much, that they died on a cross for you and rose again. Like that's the only way that statement holds weight in my mind. And But if I haven't gotten them to that point, then I just need to keep my mouth shut, because all I'm going to do is make things worse. The same way that when I was, at UCLA and other places on staff, they'd say, we need you to work with this kid. And I would say, well, unless that kid wants to work with me, I'm not going to work with them, because if they don't want this, it's only going to make things worse. Mm-hmm. I don't want to mess things up for something down the road that could be special in their life. Until they come to me, I'm not going to do it. I just got a phone call 3 weeks ago from one of my favorite kids, and we had a very interesting relationship when she was at UCLA, but she never once came and asked for help. Now, I would kind of go to her, and I could tell that she was kind of receptive, so I would try and get in her ear every now and then, but I would never push too hard. And it was so cool, because now she called and was like, hey, I want us to work together. And she had never been pushed. Mm-hmm. I never, ever pushed her. You just never know when somebody's going to be ready. But not pushing those types of things, whether it's mental training, whether it's some other thing that you believe. Like, if you believe what you believe, then just go live what you believe. And it's kind of what was fun with golf of like, I just won our club championship, and I am far from the best player in our club, but it was another one of those examples of, if I want people to listen, I need to do this stuff.
Yep.
I need to be living this stuff. And then when I am living this stuff, then the byproduct of that is, like C.S. Lewis said, if we put first things first, secondary things aren't suppressed, they increase. But we live in this world where we're taught and modeled to focus on all these secondary things.